Give it a
That's-
minute.
Oh.
Yep, we are live. We're good to go.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Good morning if you're in my time zone in Glasgow, or good night wherever you're joining us from. We're so excited to start GIFCon off this year with our opening roundtable. And we have some really fantastic people who are joining us to talk about their research today and how it intersects with our theme this year of GIFCon Boundaries and Margins. So my name is Grace Worm. I'm a third-year PhD researcher on Tamara Pierce, which is my posters behind me. And I'm just here to chair these wonderful people, so less about me. I'm going to go through first and introduce everyone, and then I'm going to ask some questions of our roundtable participants. Please feel free to jump in the chat and talk while we're discussing. If you have questions, please try and use the Zoom webinar Q&A function so that we can make sure we're seeing those questions come through on our end. And we welcome questions at any time. Hopefully we can ask some of your really amazing questions and not my boring stale ones. So we're going to get going. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty with one of our roundtable participants, but they should be appearing on video shortly, and I'm going to introduce them anyways, so we'll get started. We have Bettina Juszak, who is a second-year PhD student in the Humanities Department at York University in Toronto. She has degrees in fantasy literature from the University of Glasgow and linguistics from the University of Cambridge. Her interdisciplinary thesis research concerns the connective and effective dimensions of magical music in contemporary fantasy literature and mythological influences thereon, but she is also interested in translation, intermediality, and fan studies. She is an editor for Mapping the Impossible, Journal for Fantasy Research, and is currently in the process of publishing her second speculative fiction short story. So hello, Bettina. Dion Dobrzynski is a third-year PhD student funded by the Forge Edge Doctoral Scholarship Program run by the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research at the University of Birmingham. His project explores forest ecology in the fantasy fiction of William Morris, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Ursula Le Guin. Running immersive reading walks and interactive workshops in collaboration with Ruskin Land in the Wire Forest, Dion has been using fantasy forests to simulate cognitive, affective, and ethical engagements with a real forest environment. Mariana Rios Maldonado, her, completed her undergraduate degree at the Autonomous University of Zacatecas. What is that, Mariana? How do you say that? Zacatecas, Mexico, and her master's at Berlin Freie Universität. I can't say either of those. Her research focuses on the influence of Germanic culture and contemporary literature, Germanophobic fantastic literature, and J.R.R. Tolkien's literary production. Mariana is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow, researching ethics and otherness in Tolkien's medieval Earth narratives, funded by Mexico's National Council for Science and Technology and its National Foundation for Fine Arts and Literature. She is also the Equity and Diversity Officer at the University of Glasgow Centre for Fantastic. And lastly, we're just working on getting her video to appear in the webinar. We have Parinita, Shetty, who is a part-time public library assistant, part-time postdoctoral researcher, and sometimes children's book writer. She completed her M.Ed in children's literature and literacies at the University of Glasgow in 2017, and her PhD in education at the University of Leeds in 2022. She launched a PhD research / fan podcast called Marginality Fanish to explore intersectionality and public pedagogy in science fiction and fantasy fan podcasts. That's a mouthful. She is passionate about co-creating knowledge, including diverse voices in academic spaces, and finding a way to make academic research accessible to non-academic audiences. And right on cue, she appears at the end of her bio. So perfect timing there. So those are our wonderful participants. We're going to kick off our discussion today I'm going to ask each of these researchers to go around and tell us how you see your research intersecting with the themes of GIFCon this year, boundaries and margins. So whoever wants to kick it off, unmute yourself and kind of talk a little bit about how those ideas interact with your research. I will call on someone if needed. All right, go for it, Dion.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. So yeah, my name is Dion Dobrzynski. So yeah, I'm in the final year of my PhD. So I'm exploring forest ecology and imaginary forests of the fantasy fiction of William Morris, Tolkien, and Ursula Le Guin. Now, I thought a lot about this theme, and I saw it interacting with my research in a number of surprising ways. So in their own unique ways, these writers kind of span what is already a kind of porous boundary between naturalistic and fantastic modes of literature. And so in my work, this aspect of imaginary forests, I argue, encourages us to kind of perceive and understand real forests around us in new and interesting and, I hope, quite helpful ways. So I think that these kind of arboreal otherworlds help us envision alternative ways of living, of interacting with forests in our world, and with the wider kind of more than human realities that forests so vividly kind of embody. And this is something which I believe to have enormous potential at a time of deep disconnection from the natural world, a time of mass extinction and climate crisis. And forests are commonly kind of represented as otherworldly liminal spaces, kind of situated over yonder, kind of on the margins of civilization, and even antithetical to what is almost exclusively a human realm of kind of social order, a realm of social law. And after all, outlaws dwell in the forest, albeit restoring a kind of higher justice through their exteriority to the law. The word forest itself, like the word foreign, comes from the Latin foris, meaning outside. And fittingly, this word came over here 1,000 years ago with foreign rulers, the Normans, who imposed forest laws, which made kind of royal hunting areas out of bounds to common folk. And fantasy sometimes evokes this kind of deep sense of unknown or anarchic wildness, which is projected onto these ecosystems. But crucially, they're also reminding us that forests are, in a cultural and substantive sense, at the center of our society and kind of vulnerable to our activities, places which our human realms would quickly fall into ruin without. And so thinking about this theme, it got me thinking about the ontological hybridity of the Ents. One seven-toed foot in the temporal scale of humans and hobbits, and the other seven-toed foot in the kind of ponderous realm of tree-like beings. I thought about the way that ecotones, which is a term meaning the blurred boundaries between forests and other kind of spaces like open, urban, or agricultural spaces, so often mark generic shifts in the narratives. Characters go from anthropocentric realisms of the everyday to this kind of fantastical terra incognita of more than human realities. And finally, I think the project is crossing a kind of disciplinary boundary. So I'm situated in the English Literature Department here at Birmingham, but I'm in regular contact with people working on forests from natural sciences and social sciences. And I'm also kind of crossing an institutional boundary in that I'm working with Ruskinland, as you mentioned, which is a conservation and education charity in the Wyre Forest. And here is where I've been doing experiments. Essentially, I'm interested in how real and fantasy forests interact beyond the margins of a page. So I'm taking people out into the forest, you know, seeing how imaginary forests kind of interact in their minds with what they can experience around them, and seeing whether like a new form of environmental engagement can be created from fantasy fiction. So that's me. Yeah. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I was busy typing little notes of everything that you said. That was so interesting. And I know, I don't want to speak too much. I know Mariana probably has some things to say about Ents. So Mariana, please talk a little bit maybe about responding to Dion and your own research and how it interacts with these ideas.
Well, that was just like such an amazing introduction, because in a lot of ways, my own research touches upon just what you were saying, Dion. I don't necessarily look at forests per se, but I do look at Ents and other creatures that inhabit Middle Earth precisely under the conception of what do we call the self and what do we call the other. So my research, what I like to focus on in fantasy and the fantastic is what I would call the experience of limits. So we know that there's this interplay between the limits of reality and fiction, the natural and the supernatural, but also reason and unreason, and how basically in these constructions also the idea of self and other are formulated. So if we think about how the self is conceived theoretically and philosophically in the West, traditionally there's this history of the self being quote unquote white, cis, hetero, and male. And so how the other is precisely everything that's not that. So what I like to see in fantasy and the fantastic is how this literature allows us not only to question it, but to a certain extent how we can also come into contact with that otherness that we may never be able to experience in real life. But fiction allows us for a second to sort of like come into that encounter and put us into that position. And for that reason, I also draw upon a lot of theories, like, for example, the uncanny and the abject, because that allows us precisely to question how strict are these sort of like limits between what I call myself and what I call the other. And as a Tolkienist, I think a lot about this and how it's portrayed in Middle Earth, especially considering Tolkien as a white, cis, hetero, straight male, but also to a certain extent how, despite the fact that his text embodies what Helen Young calls habits of whiteness, there are moments in that text that resist this sort of like conception. And that's the reason why I have in my background my homies, the Haradrim, and how basically we come to sort of like experience that. And that has to do a lot with my own identity as a researcher, as Mexican, a person of color, as immigrant and queer, and how really our positions as, you know, researchers in sort of like this global age does have to do with the subject that, you know, there's something political and there's something ethical about what we do and what we say and what we study.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That was fascinating. And just this idea of what we imagine versus what we're actually experiencing is so important to this study of boundaries. And, you know, as you're saying, personal identity, I think as fantasy researchers, it's sometimes so difficult to put boundaries on where our personal identity affects our research or vice versa. But I don't want to talk too much about that. I want to give some other people a chance to respond. Parinita or Bettina? Oh, Bettina, sure.
I'm happy to go next. Yeah, so my name is Bettina. When I was thinking about the boundaries and margins topic, I realized that I really come at that from two different directions. One is my own thesis work, which is pretty interdisciplinary in that I'm looking at music in contemporary fantasy literature. So I'm mixing musicology and literary studies, and then also looking at mythological influences on this contemporary fantasy literature that has music in it. While at the same time, because I'm doing a comparative study, I'm also making an effort to look at primary sources by authors to go with the really obvious English choices. So I also have sources from different languages, the ones that I happen to be competent enough in to do research on. And then on the other side, because I am easily distracted by interesting, shiny other academic ideas, I've also recently been doing research in fan translation, particularly of Chinese web novels, both of which, again, are not particularly mainstream in academia at the moment. And there's a lot of interesting things to say about boundaries and margins of what gets translated, what doesn't get.
Oh, Bettina, we've lost you there. I know we had some struggles with the internet. If you want to maybe turn off your video and see if we can pick you up on audio, if you can hear me.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, where did you lose me?
We were talking about fan boundaries and where they begin and end. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you did hit most of it then. Yeah, so, and who those translated works reach and the kind of translation style that's used for them in terms of whether it's domesticated or foreignized, which is the standard question with these things. So I think we'll probably get to that a little later with one of the questions, so I don't want to talk about it too much, but those are the two areas that I see myself intersecting with the boundaries and margins question.
Wow, thank you. And yes, Parinita, as our last to go, please tell us how you're seeing this interaction.
Thank you so much. So yes, just jumping off on Bettina's point as well, I'm really interested in how fan podcasts specifically act as these spaces of alternative spaces of education and politicization. So I guess the boundaries and margins come in very different ways, because I was looking at how popular media, so SFF media, but other media as well, acts as a shared language to bring people from different backgrounds and identities together and create this sort of knowledge, this intersectional literacy about these different identities. Because even when you talk about like identities, but also disciplines and even fandom itself, the boundaries and margins are really shifting. And, you know, they're various, like who's privileged and who's marginalized differs. Like I'm from India. And in India, you know, like I was from the dominant religion, dominant caste, from a big city. So like lots of privileges there. But then suddenly I'm in the UK now and I'm suddenly a person of color. I'm suddenly, you know, an immigrant, but also I'm still in the university. English is my first language. So lots of sort of privileges and marginalizations intersecting there, and in fandom as well. Like, I don't know, Bettina, in your thing, how much you've seen, but there are certain hierarchies even within there where some identities and cultures are normative and some are marginalized in disciplines, like in fantasy as well. Like the call for paper said that some voices and some sort of representations dominate. So I suppose I'm really interested in how fandom and fan voices from different backgrounds can create this space to make meaning in different ways and to shed light on different aspects of the real world and use these fantastical creatures and identities and themes and characters as a cultural shorthand to make us think about people and lives that we wouldn't have encountered otherwise. So the other bit that I'm really interested in is whose knowledge and whose voices matter. So for me, I created a research/fan podcast myself as a part of my data generation, but I also looked at existing fan podcasts as sources of scholarship. And for me, like I've grown up online a lot in online fandom communities, and a lot of the way that I've learned to think, not what to think, but how to think, has happened and continues to happen online. And in academia, like what I found, so I come from a social sciences background, education, that certain kinds of knowledges are valued, whereas others aren't. And I was really trying to sort of expand those boundaries and margins a little bit, in that the kinds of knowledge and critical analysis that happens in fan podcasts emerges collectively through conversations, and it may not really reflect the kinds of theorization and ways that academics write about things, but it still happens. It's a different way that people are creating knowledge, and it doesn't make it sort of inferior, it just makes it different. So yeah, I'm really interested in talking about that and like listening to everyone else as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mariana, is that a hand to respond?
It can be.
I wasn't sure.
No, I was just like nodding to everything that Parinita said. I was going like, yes, yes, everything. Because
Yes.
so I guess what I like also being sort of like as an immigrant here in the UK, and previously when I did my master's in Germany, is sort of like coming to the realization that as a person of color, you bring like your whole tradition, your whole culture to a new world, and how that also impacts the way that you read and perceive and understand academia, and how you also develop a critical stance to it. Like I see it very much sort of like in this, I don't think that this dichotomy necessarily exists, and I wasn't aware of it until I came to the UK, sort of like between fantasy, the fantastic, and magical realism. But I do understand that, for example, coming from Latin America, where in my culture, sort of like the boundaries between what people call magic and what people call real are very tenuous, in the sense of in Mexico, everyone's like, every grandma's house is haunted, for example. And we like that doesn't necessarily defy the logic of the world. But at the same time, like another thing that I really related to what Parinita was saying is this relationship between, you know, what we see in these cultural media products, in fantasy, in the fantastic, science fiction, etc., and what we would call the secondary world, and how that does have an impact and does have an influence in the primary world. So it's sort of like this very strange relationship that fantasy has as being still considered a minor and marginal genre by many academic accounts, and yet it produces some of the most, I don't know, well-read and multi-billion-dollar products. So there's no denying that it does have an impact and it does have an influence. And these ideas that are in these products in some way shape also our contemporary culture and our way of perceiving the world. And I think that where my research stands is precisely in acknowledging sort of like, I think Parinita gave sort of like the brilliant and positive aspects of engaging with it. In my case, where I see sort of like I would say my own interest and efforts is sort of like in uncovering sort of like the whiteness of it all, and how precisely these media products are instrumentalized by certain political ideologies. Because we like to think that, you know, oh, it's just these creations sort of like sit afloat and are, I don't know, abstract or in their sole sort of niche. Well, no, actually they are used to propagate certain ideas. And so that comes to like, what is our responsibility as researchers, as fans, for those who write fan fiction, as creators, to like sort of understand that all of these things are interconnected, and we can't just sit sort of like saying here, it's like, yeah, well, I'm in academia, it doesn't really have anything to do with me. No, it actually does.
Yes, hard nodding, agreeing to all of that. Definitely, I think, you know, the reason why we as a committee were drawn to this theme for GIFCon is this unique intersection in fantasy and the fantastic that is so interdisciplinary, that is so, you know, as you were saying, Mariana, on one hand, insanely popular in popular culture, but on the other hand, really marginalized, ignored, dismissed in academia. And that interplay in especially for those of us who are fans, like you're saying, who are creative practitioners. You know, I don't want to say something cliche, but in our studies, particularly, there are these very fluid, you know, boundaries. And I think this, you know, the two things that I kept thinking about in preparation for this roundtable were this question, you know, these questions of identity as a fantasy researcher, and then also, you know, fandom. And so, you know, we're both, everyone here is picking up on these two ideas. So I'd really like to hear from some of you, you know, how can academic research shift or challenge these boundaries? And, you know, we've already sort of touched on this a little bit, but what ways does it fail to do that? And I think we see a lot of failures in addressing of that. So please, if someone wants to tell us what you think about that. Yeah, Dion, please.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what Mariana just kind of spoke to, which was this idea of cultural forms and of the academic study of cultural forms as being intrinsically political, whether you like it or not, and kind of asking ourselves this question, you know, where do my roles and responsibilities lie? And perhaps this is a failure of traditional academic kind of self-conception of what their roles and responsibilities are. And I'm thinking in particular about at this current time where, you know, we're at this most critical point in history, you know, in regards to the climate and ecological emergency. And so I'm thinking a lot recently about what my role and responsibility is, particularly in the arts and humanities, for engaging with, for pursuing a kind of academic research which isn't limited to the campus, which engages with external organizations, you know, co-creating the research, you know, not merely kind of interviewing some, but actually really interested and engaged with how readers respond to these texts, you know, from a non-academic point of view. And yeah, a kind of academic activism, which is kind of more collaborative and participatory. So that's where I see the kind of the shifting or the challenging of boundaries within kind of the roles and responsibilities of what an academic is at this time.
Yes, please, Parinita.
That absolutely resonates with me, what you said, just because I have had like I think a lot of people do this imposter syndrome in academia anyway, but also for me, it's because knowledge making isn't just as when I was growing up, my knowledge making always happened outside formal institutions and not within. So like in my school in India, in my mainstream education, they taught us what to think. They didn't teach us how to think. And my how to thinking happened online and in these other spaces. So for me in my project, I did want to make it as collaborative and participatory as possible, which is why, so the data, our fan podcast was the data itself, and it was publicly, it was published online, and I tried and recruited participants from different backgrounds and countries as well, just because I knew that I had my own gaps in knowledge and understanding. Like I wouldn't even know what I didn't know. So this sort of diversity of voices and perspectives was a way to challenge and expand that a little bit. But also what I really found in terms of co-creating, we co-created our episodes together, me and my co-participants. So like going from, so there was no question and answers for me. I sort of didn't want to do interviews because I thought my questions would direct the conversation too much. And again, like I wouldn't know the sort of my blind spots there. So we exchanged fan texts and other texts with each other before our episodes. And like based on what we were interested in, those acted as discussion prompts. So it was like thinking of it academically, it was us curating our literature together in a way that, was inclusive of different perspectives and gave us a chance to think about how each other looks at the world and understands the world and what we're interested in. And then our conversation itself, because it wasn't like rehearsed or planned or anything, we just came and chatted about the themes we were interested in, the media we were interested in. The conversation itself created something new in a way that I think one person creating knowledge wouldn't have. So this sort of collaborative knowledge making, I think, through conversation was a really important part of the process, I think, for me. And I find that in other fan podcasts as well, and like fandom, sort of the collective intelligence of fandom, like Henry Jenkins calls it, which is that nobody can know everything, but you're sort of trying and, understanding from different perspectives. And I feel like academia could really sort of learn from that in terms of knowledge making isn't this autonomous individual thing. Like, even though my thesis was, I was forced to write a solo authored thesis, but I tried and incorporated as many voices as possible to counterbalance my own. And I think the podcast itself, sort of exemplifies the knowledge making that happened. So the thesis was almost translating that for academic audiences, because the analysis, the literature, all that was already online. So I think this sort of, jumping on Dion's point, expanding ideas of where knowledge happens, how it happens. I think it's already happening. I don't think people in different communities, not just fandom, but what you're looking at as well, Dion, and Mariana and Bettina as well. It's happening in different spaces, and they're not really trying to prove themselves worthy to academic, whatever. I think academia can learn a lot from these. So it's not like knowledge exchange. I know that's become really popular, knowledge exchange, but it's actually proper collaboration where you're not thinking you have things to share, you also have things to learn.
Wow, so fascinating. This idea of collaboration is obviously so closely tied to fandom and what we're trying to do here today. Bettina, you wanted to respond? Oh, I think your video is frozen. If maybe we want to try only audio again.
Right, trying this without video again.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what Parinita was saying in terms of, I think one of the traps of academia in some ways is still that we've got these established ways of doing research on which you get graded and all of this structure that you're in, whether you want to be in it or not. And I do think it's loosening up a little bit that more different kind of projects get approved now, but that is still the default baseline, at least in all the Western universities I've been in. This may well be somewhat different in other countries, which can then stifle those kinds of just thinking about knowledge in a different way. And also there's
Oh, we've lost your audio, Bettina. Sorry. Okay.
It isn't working so well.
Oh, we can hear you again.
Right, just this last point of the objective researcher, which has kind of always been a bit of a lie, right? And at the same time, we talk about positionality, but still you need to somehow come at the topic from a neutral standpoint, which we never are. So I think we also need to be talking about that more when teaching people about research and how to approach things, because this whole objective thing just doesn't really work like that in my experience.
Mariana?
Oh, this is absolutely something that I've been thinking so much, especially I'm about to submit my thesis. And so what everybody has been saying is, I think it's so important, especially moving forward and thinking about the academia that we want in the future, and I'm not only meaning in the sense of if we want to, for those of us who are doing a PhD or doing a master's, but also, for example, for any of us who have the experience of being teachers at an undergraduate level, at an honors level, etc. Thinking about, for example, how we can encourage ourselves and the people around us to have this embodied experience with their own research and their thoughts, and being able to say things like, I see, I feel, I understand, because with that gesture is not only, for example, having that moment of putting yourself in the forefront, but taking responsibility and acknowledging where your thoughts are coming from and also your limitations, right? So I think in academia, we have sort of like this very structured model of hiding ourselves, you know, because it's considered, I don't know, I've been told, for example, that saying things in academic writing like I feel is weak. Why is it weak? You know, because a lot of my research comes from like these deep-seated interests and concerns that I see about the world around me. And I'm fortunate enough to talk about the things that I'm passionate about. Why do I have to hide? Why do I have to pretend that, you know, as Bettina was saying, like this, you know, this objectivity that doesn't exist. Like art is subjective, and that's one of the most things that is like, that's what's beautiful about it, you know, and that we can relate and not relate, and being able to sort of like see how that kind of like intersects with other people's experience, you know, how precisely crossing that boundary. And also thinking, for example, how we basically have all of these theories, you know, that we are supposed to, as academic, find ways of applying, you know, it's very, I think it has to do a lot with this model of you have an idea and a hypothesis, you have the method, then you apply the method to see if your hypothesis is correct. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, that's great. But at the same time, as Parinita was saying, why not also think of sort of like a more dialectical or dialogical conversation with these theories, where it's not about proving the hypothesis is wrong or right, or trying to see everything through that perspective of, you know, the theoretical lens, but more like I'm engaging in a conversation with an idea that has history, that has centuries, if not upon millennia of understanding. And this is, you know, how I interact with this idea and how that becomes a collaborative effort, because it's not just me, it's all the voices that are around me that have shaped me. It's the voice that I'm reading, it's the fandom that I belong to, it's the theory. And it's like, this is sort of like what I would hope academia achieves, and especially for those that have, you know, that we've had that privilege and that honor to be teaching new generations, for them to feel emboldened and to find that voice and being able to sort of like create and participate in that way, thinking about, you know, the future. And as Dion was saying, especially in the climate emergency, it's like being able to be humble enough to acknowledge your limits, but also how do you participate? How do you insert yourself and engage yourself, not only in a sort of activism, but also in finding joy? Because it seems to me like joy is a bit scarce around these days. And I think if one thing fantasy does and fandom does is precisely bring joy to the forefront.
Yes, I mean, wow, that was just so fascinating from all of you. Parinita, I see your hand, but I just wanted to quickly jump in and say, you know, for those of you who know me, my background is not in academia as we're thinking of it here, but in teaching. You know, I didn't set out to study literature. I set out to be a teacher who studies literature. And, you know, the journey that I had from that's what I thought teaching would be to what teaching actually is. And I keep coming back to a couple of ideas. First, Parinita's idea of translating what it is we want to say into this academic language, whether that's a thesis, whether it's a conference paper. And I think so much about the reason why I ended up here today was that I wanted to teach these things that were happening in popular culture that were happening outside of this classroom, this space of predetermined knowledge. And I found that I couldn't do that until, for me personally, I had to go out and I'm doing the research myself so that I can go back into the classroom and bring those experiences in. And I think, this idea of how to think is so important, not just in education and the way that we structure schools and how we learn, but in our culture and what we find, what knowledge we find important to seek out. Sorry, I didn't want to run over. Parinita, you had something to add?
No, thank you. That was great. And it also sort of bridges what I was trying to say. So what Mariana said, and actually what everyone said, I think so. This is something that I found the joy, but also the emotional investment in what you're researching. And in academia, this Bettina was saying, this objective researcher, and Mariana was talking about that a little bit. So in fandom, nobody's pretending to be objective, really. They're actually sort of really invested in these fictional worlds and these fantastical worlds and characters. And their critique emerges from the fact that they don't see themselves represented in these worlds. So they're writing themselves into the world, or they see themselves represented in incomplete ways or in sort of incorrect ways. And they're responding to that and then creating this sort of space where this knowledge making happens. And that there's this idea in academia that emotion does not belong in academia. And but what Dion was saying about the ecological emergency, how can you not be emotionally invested in that? Whatever positive and negative. And Mariana, you too, your personal identities and politics play such a big role in the texts that you read and you share. And I've sort of researched a little bit about how emotion actually balances critique and joy. So, how you're actually really interested in these things, and that's why you're interested in researching them. And one of my co-participants, she even said, she's also from India, and she said that, in her mainstream educational spaces, she was never really a good student because she didn't really care about what she was studying about. And I think that happens even now in a lot of different educational contexts. And this was the first time that she realized learning could be fun, because she was directing it was self-directed. She was researching things that she was really passionate about. And it could be anything, it could be identities, or it could be things like the environment, or, whatever you're interested in. So it can be adapted to different ways. And I think academia really misses out on leaving out or asking people to leave out certain parts of themselves and not bringing that into the conversation.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I had this moment, I think we all have this moment, and the reason why we want to research this is that it's meaningful to us. And why can't we say that, why is that not allowable to say when it's so clearly the truth? I wouldn't spend 4 years on something that I wasn't passionate about, that I didn't need to express, or need for my own personal identity. Because it's fun. I think last year at Once in Future Fantasies, we kind of talked about this idea of joy being so subversive, and it's punk to want to be happy, to feel sincere joy, or joy in the experience of art, even if it's fan art, and things like this. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I really want to get to this idea. We're kind of jumping around a little bit, focus in on this idea of fandom and people in the chat. And anger too, exactly right. Especially, as we're talking about this world we live in, right? But like I said, I really do want to focus on fandom, because that's, what we keep kind of dancing around, and what people in the chat are coming to as well. So we have a question from Andy, which I'm going to kind of use as a jumping off point. So Andy says, could you speak a bit more about identity exploration aspects of fandom and fanfic? I mean, the way many marginalized fans use fandom, fanon, and fanfic to learn about themselves and how they relate to their own identities, communities, and marginalized histories. And I would really like to hear too about fandom and this collaborative aspect that seems to be so key to this type of learning and experiencing that happens in fandom. So if anybody wanted to sort of start us out, I was just about to say Mariana looks like she's going to raise a hand. Yeah, let's start with Mariana and then we can move to Bettina.
So I'm just sort of like speaking from my own area of expertise. Like, I sort of engage with fandom in the sense of, as a Tolkienist, to see, for example, how fandom has created through fan fiction, through art, through very different means, sort of how especially people of color or people from marginalized communities have found ways to resist and contest sort of like the whiteness that exists in Middle Earth. And it's sort of like all of these blank spaces where, if you think about it, we almost know nothing about the Easterlings or the Haradrim, or there are very few female characters who are given active participation or plot. And in a world, if you consider Middle Earth as sort of like this fictional construct, of course they have lives. And sort of like imagining sort of like in those spaces, those lives, those interactions, sort of like, and fan fiction also doesn't necessarily come from the angle that they had to participate significantly in the plot of the One Ring, but their lives, imagining their lives, their domesticity is as valuable as, you know, Frodo dumping the One Ring into Orodruin. So that's one way of contesting it, I think, and one way of that the fans have found ways of inserting it. And I think related to also, for example, what people were speaking about, the joy and also the anger. And I like to use the term critical joy because I think fans from marginalized communities, and I'm talking not only about people of color, I'm talking from indigenous communities, Black fans, fans from the LGBTQ community, etc., are very much aware of the flaws and the beauty of these secondary worlds or these literary creations. And I think where we exercise critical joy is precisely in saying, and this is an act of resistance, is saying, I am completely aware of what this text is saying and how it is constructed, but through my own voice, through my own perspective, through my own way of sharing it, I will resist and find joy. It's not to be blind, it's simply not to be hampered by, you know, and so nobody can tell you you don't belong here, you know. So I think like that is sort of like the valuable act of resistance that fandom does and fan fiction does, and also in this collaborative effort of finding that community and finding other people who, when they have seen this movie or read this text, have felt also maybe, you know, question themselves. Am I capable of seeing myself there or not? Or if I've been told that I don't belong, why don't I belong? You know, and sort of like making that stance, but knowing that you're not alone. And I think that that is super important, that that's the power of fandom, when you realize you're not alone.
Yeah, wow, so powerful. I think Bettina was going to respond and then we can move to Parinita.
Yeah, just briefly about also the collective efforts in fandom. Fan translation is a really interesting aspect of that, where in traditional translation, you mostly get one person translates this book, and I mean, they might consult other people, but it's mostly them. And of course, they also get money for it, which is the other big difference. Whereas in fan translation, quite often it's a whole like group of people sharing the work between them. There will be people who speak the original language. There'll be people who don't speak it, but know a lot about the fandom. There will be people just with all kinds of different expertise surrounding the topic, and no one of them would perhaps come up with this really great translation, but together they like come together with their specialties and make that happen. And what I also find really interesting about that is that it's such a learning process, particularly for the fans who are not from the original culture or know that language very well. It's like in fandom, it's easy to think, oh, it's people just having a hobby and having fun, which we've already said is a great thing in itself, but also you do also learn things if you engage with texts from other cultures, just other people with different backgrounds, regardless of where you're doing this interaction. And I think fandom is actually particularly like, people are really keen to help other people understand what they understand about these texts and what they know of that other culture or that universe in the text. So the learning happens really playfully in a way that most standard institutions wouldn't manage.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I think we're all looking at the comment that was just posted in the chat. Parinita, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, just like resonates so much what both Mariana and Bettina said. Basically, like for me, it's like fandom is such a good way to both learn about a different way of being in the world, so like a sort of identities and perspectives that you wouldn't have. But I also found, and this, like some of my co-participants said this as well, this collective process of decolonizing your own mind and imagination in a way that not many spaces and conversations always allow room for. So, for example, with some of my Asian co-participants, Indian and other South Asian co-participants, and sort of West Asian co-participants, we were talking about how we grew up with falling in love with all these Western media texts, like what Mariana was saying, where whiteness is ever present and we didn't really see ourselves reflected, but we didn't question that because that's how it was. And Alana Bennett, she talks about this with sort of reference to Hermione Granger, about how she always looked at Hermione Granger as white because, whiteness was default in the Harry Potter world, as it is with a lot of Western media. But seeing fans sort of restory that, seeing fans say like a Black Hermione Granger is now a part of fanon, allowed her to identify the shortcomings in her imagination. And that's what happened for my co-participants and I as well. And then learn to imagine differently and think differently. And for some of my co-participants, it's actually shed light on some aspects of their own identities. Like one of them, Milena, they said how, like reading about these asexual interpretations of Lord of the Rings, of Bilbo and Frodo Baggins, as well as other, like in fandom, allowed them to sort of unpack a layer of their own identity. And this is not something, these conversations are not happening in a lot of mainstream spaces, but they are happening in fandom spaces and allow you to, sort of reveal a part of your own identity, which I think like not everybody thinks this is possible, but you don't know what's possible until you're part of these spaces.
I think you're totally right. And I think having conversations about embracing the uncomfortableness of challenging, these identity questions, these preconceived notions, I think we kind of, a lot of people go, that's hard, and then throw up their hands and, normalizing that this should be an uncomfortable process of growth, right? It is uncomfortable to challenge your own ways of thinking. Again, for me personally, I researched Tamara Pierce, who is a live author who is very active on online spaces, who I think is a lot more, for me personally, is a lot more interesting to look at her relations of fandom versus someone like J.K. Rowling, because Pierce has really been intentional about, she will answer some questions about specific, well, didn't this happen in the wrong year? And she'll say, yeah, I made a mistake. But, if someone says, oh, I always interpreted this character in that way, she's very clear about saying, that's your right. This was my interpretation as an author, but once it's art, we all share in this ownership, and I can experience this text in the same way that you do, what you bring to this text personally. and also just some really interesting, you know, this new age where we can go and speak to these authors online. I can pull up my Facebook and she will respond, you know, she's quite responsive. So, you know, there's all these conflicting layers of identity. As me as a researcher, I'm studying her, but I'm also a fan and I'm also speaking to her while also writing my thesis, which I think is just, you know, these are just such unique aspects of fandom that we don't get in other places. We are running, yes, some authors you may not want to speak to. That is very true. Yeah, well, we really haven't, we've touched on toxicity in fandom, but we don't really have time to get into all of that. Mariana. We are sort of running down on time. I don't know if any of the participants would like to add a couple of last words, last thoughts or anything like that. If you're burning too, now's your time. I'm looking at you, Mariana.
No, can we just like give it up for like the beautiful panelists and the beautiful chair today and everybody making GIFCon happen? Can we just like round of applause, round of applause, round of applause?
That was my next official step. So yes, thank you so much. I mean, I would love to go to a coffee shop and talk for 2 hours about this with all of you. This was absolutely fascinating, and I've got so many scribbled notes I need to go through. And just such a great way to, you know, begin thinking about these ideas of boundaries and margins. Yes, officially, our first panels of GIFCon start at 11:25. So you have a bit of a break, take your dog outside, get coffee, cry, then come back. We've got 1A, Fantastic Liminalities, 1B, Boundaries of Humanities, and 1C, Dungeons and Dragons and Drawing New Boundaries. So I don't know how you're going to choose, but choose. And we hope to see you around in GIFCon. Thank you so much. This was just absolutely a joy. This was just a joy. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, everyone.